In this video, we're going to talk about a little bit more about the paradigms. Um, I know you've got an assignment coming up due tomorrow, talking about your worldview stance. And the four that we've talked about and that I've sent you some literature on are postpositivism, constructivism, pragmatism, and transformative paradigm. And I sort of mentioned these to you before, but as you're thinking about finishing this assignment, I thought some of you might find it helpful to hear my perspective on some of these. So I'm just going to kind of pull up the documents that I've shared with you. I think there's some really interesting things in there, and it sort of helps point out the sort of fuzzy lines that are actually between a lot of these paradigms, and their origins actually come from some similar places. So let's dig into this just a little bit. So, and I'm using Mendeley here, so if I haven't turned you on to Mendeley yet, you should be. I highly recommend that you go ahead and get this program and start using it. So I thought this posting in the Sage Encyclopedia of Qualitative Research Methods was really helpful. The title is Postpositivism, but they actually talk about a lot of other things. They talk about constructivism, they talk a little bit about post-structuralism, and they talk about this realist post-positivism branch. And it's kind of interesting that they put these all under the heading of post-positivism. A lot of times people see post-positivism as one specific thing. They hear that word and they immediately think those people believe that there's one objective truth in the world that someone is trying to uncover, and they only use quantitative research methods. It's not actually the way that it's presented in this, and that's why I like it, because I think it provides a more open and honest way of discussing what this means and how different ideas exist about postpositivism. So if you scroll down, I've highlighted quite a lot in here, but I do think it's interesting that on page 4 of the PDF here, he sort of makes a claim about how constructivism can be overlapping with postpositivism, or maybe even that can fall completely underneath it. I'm not sure exactly which one of those two things I would claim. That probably it's more of an overlapping idea. I think constructivism has quite a lot of possibilities within it and different branches that fall underneath it. But in general, this idea of postpositivism comes from a rejection of some of the ontologies that came from positivism, which were that there was a specific objective truth in the world, and that as researchers, our role, or as humans even, our role is to try to discover it. And a central claim is a rejection of that ontology and a tension between trying to uncover it, but also realizing that it may be impossible to ever actually do that. And in a moment, when we go to constructivism, we can talk more about that and a radical view of constructivism that has a different perspective about that ontology, or I guess takes it to its natural limit. So I think that this is an important component of postpositivism, that there's this tension that exists between trying to pursue the truth and yet at the same time recognizing that that's likely or probably is impossible. And so methodologically, they talk about this here underneath this statement on the same page about requiring a degree of empathy with the actors or researchers trying to understand, and an element of reflexivity about the processes by which constructs are generated, because the idea is that since we're recognizing that the truth perhaps is not even something that independently exists from our individual realities, then we have to be clear about and be reflexive in our writing about how we develop these constructs and what they mean, because the context in which those are developed is so important for other people to understand the potential utility of that in different contexts. Especially when we realize that it's deployed in the constitution of social reality, that social reality is constituted by the individuals within it. And this is true, that it has been extremely influential in the 20th century and continuing into the 21st century. Symbolic interactionism, social constructionism, feminist and postmodern approaches. These are paradigms that exist that sometimes have quite radical viewpoints as well of ontology and thinking of the truth as completely relative or rejecting the notion of truth altogether. So discussing that within the context of postpositivism is quite interesting, and it allows you to see what types of ideals may have existed or at least originated from this sort of rejection of that ontology. He sort of goes through this historical description, which is interesting, about how it came to be, and it also seems as though maybe constructivism or the ideas of constructivism were important to the development of what became post-positivist perspective. They also don't claim any specific methods that should be used, although this was written with a description that says in this entry in the Sage Encyclopedia of Qualitative Research Methods. However, they also talk about that in terms of quantitative being a valid way of researching, and I can't find the note that I had on that in here, but there is some hints to that at some point in this document. And then he talks about the realist position, which is still, he claims, slightly different from positivism, which holds the pursuit of an objective truth that exists in the world. And so I highlighted this quote here. It says, while realism considers there's an objective social reality that could be discerned were social researchers to possess sufficiently sophisticated tools, realism recognizes that when it comes to studying the social world, our tools, human understanding and interpretation, are inevitably value-laden, theory-laden, and context-dependent. All that can be hoped for is that by continual efforts towards methodological rigor, triangulation from various data sources, and meticulous analysis of data, that approximation to the truth can be derived and generalized. So they do hold that there is an objective truth. They are hoping that in the future there is a way to actually capture what that objective truth is, but that it might be only closer and closer approximations to that truth. On the other hand, the constructivist would not take that perspective. So let's move to thinking about the constructivist, which there is some great material in this document also about constructivism. But if we move to the von Glasersfeld article, I really like this piece in the beginning, although you might find it a bit difficult to connect with because it's quite philosophical in its language. But I really like this piece at the beginning, talking about these different words that exist in the Greek language for knowledge. And when we think about our own language, this is a tension I've always felt, that we don't have these words, different words for knowledge. And there's this also sort of tension between thinking about knowledge versus a belief. And I think here we have more flexibility in thinking about what knowledge we can consider trying to make sense of. Which one of these four realms of knowledge are we talking about whenever we say radical constructivism, or when we say constructivism, or even when we think about our own epistemological stance? It might differ across these four types of knowledge, which I think is what some of you were grappling with in your Discord discussions. Specifically in thinking about the difference between understanding of the rational kind, episteme, or this idea of gnosis, true knowledge as claimed by metaphysicians. Metaphysical meaning beyond our physical world. And I think what I have found important is that in this radical constructivist perspective, they simply reject the idea of ontology. Reject, what I mean by that is they sort of ignore that because they don't know if it exists or not. So they're going to choose to not even consider whether it exists. And von Glasersfeld kind of reflects back to some of these statements here. This piece where he cites Diels saying, even if a man were to represent himself the world exactly as it is, he could not discover that this is the case. The reason why this discovery is impossible was put in its simplest form by George Berkeley. We shall find it impossible for us to conceive a likeness except only between our ideas. So the idea here is that you have the ability to know, to be able perhaps to present yourself to the entire world in all of your truth of all of who you are. But even if you could do that, you wouldn't even recognize that as yourself. Basically, they are using this sort of understanding as a way of saying, if there is an objective truth out there, it is not actually knowable. Because so much of what our knowledge, our episteme knowledge might be, is only understood through our own experiences. And that doesn't mean that the idea of teaching is sort of moot. He goes into detail about that later, and I hope you found that helpful in thinking about that. And I also liked this idea here about thinking about the existence of God as being all-powerful, ubiquitous, omniscient, things that we can't experience, and therefore we can't know such a being except through the mystic's contemplation. And this is the point at which he says, he sort of makes the case that when we're talking about radical constructivism, we're talking about the episteme knowledge, not the gnosis knowledge. That's not something that they're even going to claim is knowable, and so it's outside of the realm of what radical constructivism attempts to try to explain. Okay, so if we go down to the piece about teaching, I think that's where things get a little bit more clarified. At least this is where I feel the most clarity, is when I think about it from a teaching perspective. The idea of teaching, he says, is understanding can only be a matter of compatibility, not a matter of identity of ideas or conceptual constructs. We can only speak of fit, not match, and the meaning of fit must be further reduced. An item fits when it does not run into constraints. And this has particular implications on teaching because it requires that the teacher makes sense of what the student knows in terms of how that student has constructed their knowledge and the interconnections it has between what you might call knowledge elements. So if you can picture sort of the way I picture this, at least, is sort of like a node link diagram with boxes and lines drawn between them of varying thicknesses based on how strong those connections might be and how sophisticated that knowledge structure might actually look. And by understanding that, that is how a teacher can help a student learn and guide their learning. And there was a section on guiding learning, I believe. I think I skipped it, but that is a really important piece of this, is how to guide the learning based on that understanding, and how to view what might be called a misconception as rather simply the student's way of knowing something. And to that student, it makes perfect sense. And so it's really important. And actually, I'm seeing that right here on the page. Such constructs or theory may be considered misconceptions from the teacher's point of view because they're incompatible with the concepts and theories sanctioned by the particular discipline at the moment. Or another way to say that is, to the teacher, it is viewed as a misconception because the teacher's own knowledge construct tells them that that doesn't fit. But because these concepts and theories make sense to the students, they also determine to a large extent what the students see. So it's important to understand that and to sort of try to pick apart how you might help that student create another set of knowledge in order to help them move past that misconception that may be blocking them from furthering their knowledge, or understanding that misconception could be a useful tool in helping them move to a more sophisticated version of their knowledge. And I thought that this piece I highlighted in green here at the end was particularly helpful in making sense of constructivism. What thinking human beings do or say can nearly always be assumed to make sense to them at the moment. It is therefore nothing less than an insult to tell them point blank that the answer they have worked out for a given question is wrong. And he claims this should go for everyone. So, and this goes for you where you're at right now. Remember that these ideas can be quite deep. This world stance that we're trying to make sense of right now, these different paradigms, but grasping just an initial understanding of them and realizing that these things are quite gray in terms of where they intersect with one another is really important. And to make sense of it in whatever way you can now, with the intent that further understanding will develop over time. And the goal is not to make sense of this perfectly, and remembering that there's other ideas about what some of these things mean and different branches that sort of stem off of these things that we're talking about from a broad perspective. All right, and that leads us to pragmatic paradigm. And the pragmatic paradigm really just simply right off the bat says, we don't know what's best, so we're going to be open to anything and everything and see what could be most helpful for the specific research question that you might have. Now, it's important to realize as we start to talk about pragmatic is that the worldview stance that you take inherently has implications on the methods that you use to conduct an empirical investigation, to collect data, who you collect data on, how you collect it, what measurement tools you might use, whether that be a survey, a Likert scale, interviews, observations of classrooms, let's say. Whatever the data collection method might be depends on how you view the world and what your specific paradigm is. So I thought this section here was helpful. Pragmatism, when regarded as an alternative paradigm, sidesteps the contentious issues of truth and reality. It is therefore not to be accepts philosophically that there are singular and multiple realities that are open to empirical inquiry and orients itself toward solving practical problems in the real world. So, and they're citing Dewey here all the way back to 1925, who is a lot of times attributed to being a pragmatist. And then another quote that I found helpful in thinking about pragmatism, and this article was really helpful because it describes how pragmatism worked in a specific study that they conducted. So if you haven't read this yet, please do read it. It's very helpful. And then a couple of quotes here at the end that I found helpful as well. This first one said, "In a way, pragmatism is a commitment to uncertainty, an acknowledgement that any knowledge produced through research is relative and not absolute, that even if there are causal relationships, they are transitory and hard to identify. This commitment to uncertainty is different from philosophical skepticism, saying that we cannot know anything, but an appreciation that relationships, structures, and events that follow stable patterns are open to shifts and changes dependent on precarious and unpredictable occurrences and events." And if you read this, it really does feel like a pragmatist is not claiming any specific ontological reality exists independent of human experience or of individuals. And it's also, at the same time, not saying that there's any specific epistemology that should be accepted, but it is making room for this acceptance that context is super important in order to understand what we do as researchers, and in order to understand human experience and phenomenons. And then this piece in green that I thought was really an important statement. "The acknowledgement of the unpredictable human element forces pragmatic researchers to be flexible and open to the emergence of unexpected data. This means that in Kuhn's terms, as a paradigmatic constraint, pragmatism reminds researchers of their duty to be curious and adaptable." So in other words, it's almost, to me, it feels like they're making a claim that we should not feel stuck to the process of research as something that is rigid, that has to be set out in a specific way at the beginning and stay that way, because we are expecting unexpected data as a pragmatist. Therefore, when it happens, you have to adjust what you're doing and adapt to that situation, and even be willing to change your theoretical basis for what you're trying to make sense of. And recognize that maybe when you see that unexpected data, that whatever theory you thought was going to be helpful for you may no longer be helpful for you. There may be things that you have to do differently. So that leads us to the transformative paradigm. And you can see in the transformative paradigm how it also has some similar ontological and epistemological perspectives as constructivism. There is a nice table in here. Where is it at? Here we go. I thought this table was really helpful. I'm glad they put this in here. And I highlighted some pieces that I think are helpful in making sense of what makes it transformative as opposed to, let's say, a constructivist perspective or some other one. So first of all, the ontology, there are multiple realities that are socially constructed. So it is sort of giving a nod to the origins of constructivism that reject the idea of ontology. It's giving a nod to the social constructivists and the sociocultural theories that exist in saying, yeah, these things are socially constructed, therefore there's multiple realities and yours and mine may be different. But the thing that is more explicit about this is that there are differences in social, political, cultural, economic, ethnic, racial, gender, age, and disability values, and those define realities. So that is the focus of the transformative paradigm, and I would say we probably shouldn't limit it to this list. This list will grow as we learn about other areas in which there are power differentials that oppress people. And epistemologically, relating to knowledge and how knowledge is obtained or acquired, they say to know realities, it's necessary to have an interactive link between the researcher and the participants. Knowledge is socially and historically located within a complex cultural context. This also has a basis in what we saw in the postpositivist perspective and in constructivist perspectives. Respect for culture and awareness of power relations. Again, this idea of power relations. Methodology, they're saying it doesn't matter. Pick whatever is useful to this end of understanding and dismantling the ideas of power. Methods should be adjusted to accommodate cultural complexity. Power issues should be explicitly addressed. And issues of discrimination and oppression should be recognized. And with these statements, it does feel very pragmatic. But the idea of transformative paradigm provides some specificity. So yes, in a sense, there is a lot of pragmatism embedded within this transformative paradigm. But it has this explicit focus on dealing with oppression and power. They provide even an axiology with three spokes to that: respect, beneficence, and justice. Respect, talking about cultural norms of interaction and who you're studying. Beneficent, resulting in promotion of human rights. And then, of course, with an explicit focus on a social justice agenda. And this is very clear across these. That's why I really like this table that they put in here. And then there is a quote that I thought was really helpful here, and I do suggest you read the rest of this paper because it also puts it within the context of a study in order to make more sense of it. But they say the transformative paradigm's ontological assumption poses these questions. How is reality defined? By whom? Whose reality is given privilege? What are the social justice implications of accepting reality that has not been subjected to a critical analysis on the basis of power differentials? And how can mixed methods shed light on the capture and interpretation of reality? I hope that these are helpful. So I don't think that any specific one of these is going to be where you feel like you fit and that you don't fit into the other ones. In fact, I think it's plausible to expect that you might feel like you fit in all of them. And that just goes to show how much maybe you really do consider this idea of an ontological, objective reality being true or not. So I hope this is helpful in thinking about these ideas further as you're writing your worldview stance paper. And please cite these things as you're writing to show why you think you fit in specific ways and what your actual stance might be.